Welcome to another episode of the Frankenstein Reader's Guide, the series of videos where I take a look at all the aspects of Mary Shelley's famous novel. We've looked at the main characters already. In this video we're going to be looking at some of the key side characters: Elizabeth, Lavenza, Justine Moritz and Henry Clerval. We'll be looking at how these characters clash with Victor and the monster, how they reflect aspects of his personality or complement it, and especially Justine, who I think is an interesting character because I think of all the human characters, she represents the monster. She has a very similar trajectory to the monster. Part 1. Justine Moritz. In my view, Justine is one of the most wronged characters in the whole of Frankenstein. She's damned both by the creature, who commits her for a crime that he did, and also she's damned by society, who take her as guilty for doing that crime. She's also very similar to the creature in that she is also damned for things that have nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with just the sort of person that she is. She might be conventionally attractive to look at, but because of her background as a lower class human being, she is seen as someone who is very easily able to commit crime, and that's part of why she ends up being arrested and condemned. As we'll see when we look at Elizabeth's character, Justine is someone who is also rescued from a poor upbringing by the Frankenstein family, but the way in which she's adopted is slightly different from Elizabeth. Justine was the third child of a widow, and she wasn't very well liked by her mother. Her mother was quite cruel to her. Now, Elizabeth's aunt observed this and decided to rescue Justine from this horrible situation and took them into the family fold as a servant. Now, I think there's already a parallel here between Justine's backstory and the monster, in that, like the monster, Justine is also rejected by her creator, in this case, her mother. And there's a great irony in this, because obviously Victor will eventually reject his creation, the monster, and the first person who is condemned because of the monster's crimes is someone who is also rejected by their mother. And I think one way that Shelley really brings out this connection is that she has Justine's mother die around the same time that Victor creates and rejects his monster. Now, the key difference between Elizabeth and Justine is that while Elizabeth is fully brought in as an equal in the family, Justine is kept as a servant even if she's treated very well, and there's hints that in the background people would typically frown upon this kind of thing, and that it's appropriate that if you're going to adopt someone as a wealthy family who is from a poor background, you would take them in as a servant because they don't deserve to be elevated to the noble status of everyone else. However, Elizabeth does talk about the decision to adopt Justine, and she sort of says something that's quite ironic because she presents Switzerland as this wonderful accepting place, not like those other European countries, but as we'll see when Justine gets condemned, everything that Elizabeth says here turns out to be completely untrue. The republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it. Hence there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders, being neither so poor nor so despised, their manners are more refined and moral. A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France or England. Justine, thus received into the family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. So we can see already there's this implication of classism here, that the lower orders are seen as not refined, not entirely moral, compared to the nobility. And while Elizabeth is quite proud to live in a country where that is not the way that people view the underclasses, it turns out that these things are still very much entrenched in the culture. It also means that Justine can only be accepted into the family as a servant, so she's not quite on the same level as Elizabeth, despite the fact that both of them were adopted from poor circumstances. Now, to be fair to Elizabeth, she remains faithful to Justine when she's condemned for the crime, and so she certainly lives up to what she was saying there, but unfortunately, the rest of society doesn't. They very quickly turn on Justine and view her as an ungrateful servant, and it just goes to show how easily these people still view her as a lesser being because of her background. And so they're willing to condemn her based off of pretty circumstantial evidence. The only reason why they think she committed the crime is because she has an object on her that was stolen from the body of Victor's younger brother. Now, during the court case, Elizabeth does have a moment where she stands up and defends Justine, but we also get a little bit of insight into the other people who are called upon to speak on her behalf. Several witnesses were called who had known Justine for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty had rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. And this isn't just the neighbourhood people either. The priest also thinks that Justine is guilty and actually bullies her into confessing to the crime, scaring her with eternal damnation. And so he ultimately doubly damns her again, because now she's condemned, by society and potentially by God as well. Now, as I said, Elizabeth does come forward and she gives a really powerful, moving speech in Justine's favour, but unfortunately, people are moved very much by Elizabeth's appeal because they think that she's well-spoken and wonderful, but they think that she's ultimately a dupe to the duplicitous Justine. A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but it was excited by her generous interference and not in favour of poor Justine, on whom the public indignation was turned with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. So in doing this, the crowd have shown that they are actually like the other countries that Elizabeth mentioned. They do ultimately look down on the lower classes, and they think that the lower classes should be eternally grateful and, wonderful and in awe of their betters who have helped them, and the minute they slip up, they're going to come down on them like a ton of bricks, as we see with Justine. And it's for this reason why I really feel bad for Justine and think that she is ultimately just as rejected as the monster in the end. She does still have some people who have faith in her, so she's not quite as damned as him. She has Elizabeth, who believes in her innocence. She has Victor, not that he's much help, but he does know that she's innocent. And she has herself and the knowledge that she is innocent as well. So she does have certain things that the monster doesn't have, but she's rejected by her parent, she's rejected by society, and she's even rejected by God in the end as well. So it's a pretty damning result for Justine, and it's one reason why I think she is one of the most tragic characters in the story. The final thing I want to talk about with respect to Justine is the way that guilt and innocence are portrayed through her character and through Victor. Because Victor is someone who constantly feels this guilt because he knows that all of this that's going on is his fault, and so internally he's got all of this stuff going on. Whereas Justine is sometimes described as calm and resolved because she knows that she is innocent. And so this leads Victor to reflect upon the nature of guilt and innocence and what that means when you're attacked for a crime. Obviously, if you're guilty, he thinks that this is worse than if you're innocent. So the first thing that Victor says of Justine when she appears in court is, "The appearance of Justine was calm, although her emotions do start to fluctuate during the trial. When she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible, though variable voice." So at least according to Victor, who may or may not be reliable here, but I think he's telling the truth, her innocence gives her this kind of assurance and resolve that keeps her, going throughout this terrible ordeal. In fact, Victor even goes so far as to envy Justine when she dies. He says, "Justine died, she rested, and I was alive." It's worse for him, at least according to himself, because he knows that he's to blame for everything that just happened, and he failed to do anything about it, and he has to continue living with that guilt. Now that Justine is gone, she can rest. So both death and innocence are sources of peace, even for those that are condemned to terrible fates. Now, I do somewhat agree with the moral sentiment here. I've been accused of things I haven't done before, and it's a very different feeling from when you're accused of something that you have done. And so I can see where he's coming from. However, at the same time, I can't help but feel a little bit disgusted by Victor. It's almost like he's trying to console himself by, putting Justine on this pedestal and saying, well, she's innocent and that's great and she can now rest and all of this. And that might be true, but it would have been better if she hadn't have been condemned for something that she didn't do altogether. And the fact that Victor does nothing really to help Justine is pretty damning of his character. He's always giving these rationalizations about, well, no one would believe him and all of this. But, Elizabeth can't do much to help because she doesn't have any direct evidence of Justine's guilt, but she still gets up and gives a speech. He could have done something. But the fact is, he doesn't do anything, and then he seems to have this, rationalization that deifies Justine so that he can feel better about himself. So it's one of those bits of the story that really makes me dislike Victor, at least morally speaking. And one thing I have to wonder is, would Victor have acted the same if Elizabeth was the one that was condemned? Because that is the woman that he loves. Would he really have just sat back and watched while society, condemned her and strung her up? I don't think so. So it just comes across as a really nasty side of his character. It shows his cowardice to stand up for himself and to do what's right. And it, shows that he's not really willing to take responsibility in a lot of ways for his actions. We looked at this in the previous video where he's always trying to blame the monster for everything that went wrong and doesn't often look inward to himself. And again, it seems like he does that with Justine's death as well. Part 2, Elizabeth Levenza. So Elizabeth Levenza is Victor's adopted cousin or sister, and her backstory reveals, again, more of the kindness of Victor's family, especially his mother, who serves as pretty much the antithesis of Victor, because Victor's mother is a deeply caring, compassionate woman, as is his father as well. And we find that she is the reason why Elizabeth was adopted in the first place. So we learn that Victor's parents' benevolent disposition often made them enter the cottages of the poor. And this wasn't just out of some kind of noble idea about, oh, we do a bit of charity on the weekend, you know. It was a more genuine, commitment to helping others. And we learn that Caroline, Victor's mother, had a real passion for doing this. If you remember, Caroline herself had a background similar to this. She was also raised out of poverty, and so she feels some kind of passion to really help people. Remembering what she had suffered and how she had been relieved, for her to act in her turn the guardian angel to the afflicted. So it's because of this passion that they eventually meet Elizabeth's family, who are described as a peasant and his wife, hard-working, bent down by care and labour, distributing a scanty meal to 5 hungry babes. But then we get potentially a darker colouring to Caroline's nature. This is the tricky part of the book, because obviously it's Victor who is describing this, so we don't know if this is Caroline's view or if this is Victor's view of the situation. But it seems that, from the description, that what attracts Caroline specifically to Elizabeth is Elizabeth's appearance rather than her moral character. Elizabeth appeared of a different stock. The others were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants. This child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to set a crown of distinction on her head. Her brow was so clear and ample, her blue eyes cloudless, and her lips and the moulding of her face so expressive of sensibility and sweetness, that none could behold her without looking on her as a distinct species, and being heaven-sent, and bearing a celestial stamp in all her features. So again, this is Victor's description, and he is a very shallow person, so it's possible that he is colouring the past and colouring Caroline's motivations. But in any case, it does come across like this is a superficial reason to adopt someone. There are several children here, and your reason for picking this one is that it's not a dark-eyed little vagrant-looking thing, which is a pretty mean way to look at things. Personally, I think this is Victor's view rather than Caroline's. I don't think she is like this as a person, but we don't have her perspective, so we don't fully know this. Of course, Elizabeth does turn out to be all of those things, so it's not saying that Elizabeth is ultimately a bad person underneath. She is caring, she is kind, but the point is that when Victor is describing the reason for her adoption, he's choosing the superficial description of her rather than anything to do with her actual moral actions or character. Another thing that sets Elizabeth apart is that we learn that she is actually the foster daughter of this family, and that actually she has a noble background as well, which is why, unlike Justine, who is, she stays at the level of a servant, Elizabeth is allowed to be raised to be an equal member of the family, being Victor's adopted sister, rather than just the servant. Now, Victor is very possessive of Elizabeth, and this is clear from the moment that they meet that he cherishes her. In fact, when Victor's mother brings her home for the first time, she describes in a playful way that she has a little present for him. But unfortunately, Victor does seem to take these words seriously, but we have to remember he is a child at this point, and so he says, I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally, and looked on Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed on her I received as made to a possession of my own. No word, no expression, could body forth the kind of relation into which she stood to me, my more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only. So there is something sweet in this. You have to remember that this is a young boy, and so, kids have different, ways of expressing their attachments to each other. But there's also something, again, selfish in the way that Victor describes Elizabeth in this situation. He's describing her as a possession. She's not quite her own person. And this isn't, the ideal way to describe another human being. As with Henry, we'll see this in a minute, Elizabeth also serves as a foil in many ways to Victor's personality, and this is something that he himself acknowledges. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition, but, with all my ardour, I was capable of a more intense application, and was more deeply smitten with the thirst for knowledge. She busied herself with following the aerial creations of the poets, and in the majestic and wondrous scenes which surrounded our Swiss home. She found ample scope for admiration and delight, while my companion contemplated with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearances of things. I delighted in investigating their causes. So Elizabeth is someone who is very much in love with the natural world, and she's happy to not only contemplate that natural world, but just exist within it. She doesn't set herself apart. She doesn't want to tear that world apart. She just is happy and content with nature as it is and the natural beauty of that. But Victor is dissatisfied with this. For him, he doesn't just want to be in nature. He wants to divine the secrets underneath everything, because ultimately he wants to control nature. So he is someone who is restless for truth, whereas she is just happy to accept the mysteries of nature as they are. And this is why in many ways Elizabeth, similar to Henry, acts as a kind of grounding force for Victor. She's always there to recenter him, and whenever she reappears in the novel, she does have this ability to calm him in many ways. But it's also why, whenever he is doing his experiments, he has to get away from Elizabeth. He can't do those kinds of things with Elizabeth around, because she is someone who would, in a sense, tame him. She would keep him away from doing those kinds of things, and so he needs to reject her in order to go out and divine the secrets of nature that he's after. I think this also has a broader symbolic meaning with respect to the balance between masculine and feminine energy, with the masculine energy being something that is typically, prospecting, about discovering, controlling, whereas the feminine energy tends to be much more grounded in nature and grounded in reality. And Elizabeth is sort of that feminine energy that is something that centers and restrains the more masculine energy that Victor has, because ultimately without that it can lead to quite dangerous things, as we see with his creation of the monster. Now, as Elizabeth grows up, she takes on the role of Caroline within the family. When Elizabeth catches the scarlet fever, Caroline stays with her, despite people saying that she shouldn't, and unfortunately this leads to Caroline contracting the illness and dying. And from that point on, Elizabeth takes Caroline's role, and she very much becomes the one who is the most devoted to the family, and she's the one who really keeps everything together. And this is why, when Justine is accused, it should come as no surprise that Elizabeth is going to stand up for her, because as far as Elizabeth is concerned, Justine really is her sister. She doesn't care about societal norms, about that kind of stuff, and we saw that from that quote that we talked about before, where she does really think that the lower classes are just as worthy as the people of her class. Elizabeth's defense of Justine, again, also works as a nice contrast to Victor, because she's defending Justine in court despite having no real strong evidence to go on. She just has a deep moral conviction and deep trust in Justine, and that is enough for her to speak on her friend's behalf, whereas Victor has much more reason, as we've already said, to stand up for Justine, but refuses to do so. Ultimately, Victor is just too selfish and concerned with his own pain and guilt, while Elizabeth is always concerned with others. I think the final words that Elizabeth says to Victor in the story really bring out the fundamental contrast in their characters, and they also reveal a little bit of her own perceptiveness, her ability to detect that there isn't something quite right going on. So Elizabeth is finally murdered by the creature on her wedding night to Victor, and they have got married. They've then gone to this chateau, and they're together in the evening, and she says this to Victor just before she retires for the night, where she's eventually killed. Something whispered to me not to depend too much on the prospect that is opened before us, but I will not listen to such a sinister voice. Observe how fast we move along, and how the clouds, which sometimes obscure and sometimes rise above the dome of Mont Blanc, render this scene of beauty still more interesting. Look also at the innumerable fish that are swimming in clear waters, where we can distinguish every pebble that lies at the bottom. What a divine day! How happy and serene all nature appears. Her calling the day divine and focusing on the appearance of nature and finding solace in it, despite her fears that something isn't quite right, reveal everything that Victor said earlier about her nature. It's also interesting that she uses the word divine, because for Victor, divinity, he usually uses this word with respect to finding these secrets of nature and having mastery over them. For him, that's what the divine is. It's becoming godlike. Whereas for Elizabeth, what is divine is just the appearance and beauty of nature, which we can be a part of, but we don't necessarily need to become gods ourselves to control it. In her final moment in the story, Elizabeth is pleading for Victor to just take a step back and enjoy nature as it is, to be content within it, to be content to be a creation of God and divine in that way, rather than trying to become a god himself. But unfortunately it is too late, as Victor has already offended nature and abused it, and Elizabeth will ultimately face the consequences of his mistake. Part 3. Henry Clerval. So Henry is similar to Elizabeth in that he acts as a grounding force for Victor, and he also contrasts with him in different ways, but unlike Elizabeth, where it's a sort of masculine versus feminine energy thing going on, I think with Henry it's more like two different ideals of masculinity. And I think that Henry is a more balanced form of masculinity, because he has some of those adventurous impulses, but he's also grounded a little bit more in morality. He's grounded in being happy as a part of nature. He doesn't want to sort of control anything, and so it's a nice subtle difference between him and Victor, and also Elizabeth. So you have these very different ways of contrasting with his character. One of the very first things we learn about Henry is that he's morally grounded and centered in a way that Victor is not. Clerval occupied himself, so to speak, with the moral relations of things. The busy stage of life, the virtues of heroes, and the actions of men were his theme, and his hope and his dream was to become one among those whose names are recorded in story as the gallant and adventurous benefactors of our species. Victor's interest in science is ultimately an amoral one. He doesn't really care about the morality of what he does until it's too late and he's forced to confront it. But Henry, we're learning right away, is deeply grounded in these moral considerations. Now, this isn't quite the same as Elizabeth, who it's less about sort of moral principles and heroic duty and all of that. That's a more masculine style of looking at morality. Elizabeth is much more grounded in her personal relationships. She recognizes that she has these duties of care to those in her immediate family, and that's how she expresses her morality. Whereas Henry is more like, he's a chivalrous person. He enjoys heroes and stories of great virtue, and so he's still very much grounded in his responsibilities to others. He cares about morality, but it's in a different, maybe more masculine way to Elizabeth. And in any case, both of them are very different from Victor, who doesn't have this moral grounding at all. For him, it's all about uncovering these secrets at more or less any cost. So Victor goes off to university, and that's when he begins his experiments and eventually creates the monster. And Henry eventually goes to the university as well after Victor gets sick, after he's rejected the monster. And this gives us more insight into the contrast between these two characters. We learn that Henry doesn't share Victor's interest in natural philosophy, and that he came to university to study the Eastern traditions with a focus on the Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit languages. Victor actually briefly joins Henry in his studies as a way of recuperating from his experiment and the horror that unfolded because of that. And he actually does start to find some peace in this kind of study. It leads him to make some interesting comparisons between Eastern and Western storytelling and poetry. Of the Eastern poems, he says, "Their melancholy is soothing, and their joy elevating, to a degree I never experienced in studying the authors of any country. When you read their writings, life appears to consist in a warm sun and a garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of a fair enemy, and the fire that consumes your own heart. How different from the manly and heroical poetry of Greece and Rome." So Victor is noticing a key difference here between Eastern spirituality and myth, which is often focused on settling oneself in nature. You could think of practices like meditation or mindfulness being reflected of that, and Western heroic epics, which are typically concerned with these big, sweeping narrative events, with heroes, discovery, people going on great deeds and uncovering great truths. It's very much a action-oriented genre of poem. Now, studying these Eastern traditions, these Eastern stories, gives Henry this centeredness in nature that, again, isn't all that different from Elizabeth. But Victor, unfortunately, he does find some peace in this. He ultimately can't be content with it because of his ambitious desires. He ultimately does want to be like that traditional hero discovering the secrets of nature. Another difference here, again, is the topic that Henry is interested in. He's interested in learning the languages of other places. And this shows, I think, symbolically at least, that he is a deeply empathetic person, in the sense that what he's interested in is communication. He wants to understand people that are very different from himself. And so he does have that interest, to discover, to find out new things, but it's still very much grounded in human beings and connecting with other human beings from very different places. Whereas Victor is someone who doesn't really care about human beings. He cares about things. He cares about the laws of nature. And that is what he is interested in engaging with. And that's why ultimately he can't all be that interested in something like the stuff that Henry's interested in, because that stuff is ultimately concerned with people, not with, the divine laws of nature. A distinguishing feature of Henry is that he's one of the few characters who actually gets to travel around with Victor, especially around the time that he is conducting his experiments. He's also there to console Victor in the wake of William's death. He says to Victor, "The pang is over, his sufferings are at an end forever. A sword covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a subject for pity. We must reserve that for his miserable survivors." One thing that I noticed about Henry's advice to Victor here, his consolation, is he's ultimately echoing what Victor will later say about Justine when she died, trying to console himself by saying, well, she's at rest, and so I don't need to worry about her anymore. And I wonder if he's actually taken that from what Henry has said to him here, because chronologically speaking, he will have had this advice first. And so there seems to be an echoing of Henry in what Victor says at that moment. But it also reveals something else about Henry, which is that fundamentally he's on the side of life. All of his affections, his cares, his passions are for those that live. And so when William is dead, his view is, you know, you can be sad about that, but ultimately you need to care for those that are still living, the people that actually are still experiencing the pain and suffering. And this is again contrast to Victor, who really isn't on the side of life at all in a lot of ways. He's obsessed with death, he's obsessed with having control over death, and while you might think that that ultimately is on the side of life, in a way it really isn't, because to be on the side of life, I think you have to ultimately make your peace with death rather than trying to overcome it. And at least in this story, I think the proof of that is that by trying to overcome death, all Victor does is create more death for everyone that he knows, ultimately including himself. So just as he comes to Victor when he's sick after he creates the creature initially and rejects him, he also travels with Victor again when Victor goes off to Britain in order to do his final experiment to make a companion for the monster. Ultimately, this will turn into a tragedy as Henry will die on this trip, murdered by the monster. And what's interesting is that his trajectory here actually resembles Elizabeth in many ways. During their journey, we find Henry extolling the beauties of nature and trying to get Victor to just be happy in nature, which again echoes what Elizabeth will eventually say to Victor before she dies. Victor recognizes this as they're traveling, and he says, "How great was the contrast between us. He was alive to every new scene, joyful when he saw the beauties of the setting sun, and more happy when he beheld it rise and recommence a new day. He pointed out to me the shifting colours of the landscape and the appearance of the sky. 'This is what it is to live,' he cried. 'Now I enjoy existence. But you, my dear Frankenstein, wherefore are you desponding and sorrowful?'" So at this point, Victor really struggles to find any peace in nature, which is something that earlier in the novel he could always find some peace in, even when he was at his most distressed. And Henry is noticing here that Victor's pursuit of nature has really just disenchanted nature for him. In trying to reach out and control it and to uncover all these secrets, he's become horrified by everything that he's done, and now he's no longer able to find peace and just sit in nature as a happy being because he's gone too far. Whereas for Henry, his intellectual pursuits, his aspirations, have only made him appreciate nature more, and it's something that's only become more enchanting to him. Part 4, Conclusion. So we've looked at the other three central characters in Frankenstein, and how they relate to the monster, and how they relate to Victor, and also just what they represent in themselves. We saw Justine as a kind of human mirror for the monster, someone who is condemned by her parent and by society, who is ultimately an innocent bystander to everything that has gone on. We looked at Elizabeth and how she acts as a sort of grounding force for Victor, how she represents someone who is ultimately concerned with her personal relationships to others, and how that makes her in many ways more brave than Victor. She stands up for Justine when she's condemned, but Victor doesn't do the same. And then we looked at Henry and how he represents a more positive ideal of masculinity, still very curious to understand things, but not so much that he's putting his moral intuitions aside. And that is it for this episode of the Frankenstein Reader's Guide. If you have any further thoughts on these characters, do let me know down in the comments. And if you have any questions about the book in general, let me know as well, because I might do an episode where I respond to some of those questions after the main series is over. Until next time, ta-ra.